Nix Umbra. Originally released in November of this year through solo indie developer Ilzard, is a game that perhaps can best be summarised as the sweet spot amalgamation of Devil Daggers and never-ending nightmares. It's brief, it's theoretically endless, and it's bleak. Really, really fucking bleak. Having taken such clear inspiration from the previously mentioned Sorath title, one that I also happened to review last year, Nix Umbra's apparent utilisation of the Devil Daggers premise is honestly one that I wasn't initially expecting when going into the game. I'd casually followed the developer on Twitter, seen a trailer and some screenshots, wishlisted it on Steam, yada yada, but aside from loving the aesthetic look of the game, I don't think it ever twigged in my head that Nix Umbra would be an experience that is both rather familiar, and yet also extremely oppressive. That's not to say that the developer misrepresented the game, because from what I now can see and understand, they really didn't, but I think in my mind I was expecting something a little more story-driven, a hellish odyssey into the game's miserably grim world of monochrome. I figured I'd be exploring an inhospitable landscape, being doused in occult lore and fending off evil beasties whilst working towards an endgame, perhaps even running into a few mysterious strangers along the way who might be able to help me out. Fear and Hunger style. And, well, that impression was mostly very wrong. I also need to state for the sake of transparency that the developer was in fact kind enough to send me a review copy of the game, so it honestly took me by surprise when I realised how much I had completely misunderstood. Instead of being a story-driven experience, Nix Umbra is more akin to a gothic roguelike arena shooter. There's no story to be told, no additional characters or levels. In fact, there's really no progression of any kind aside from the 5 to 10 minutes that you perhaps manage to survive, after which you'll be dealing with a permadeath reset that then kicks your ass all the way back to the beginning of the game. Because you're going to die a lot in Nix Umbra. Trust me, it's going to happen. You're going to get into a position of feeling good about yourself, and then suddenly it's going to end, very suddenly. And if that sounds a little cruel, well, yeah, it is. But believe me when I tell you that this is a good thing. Because in spite of the fact I essentially booted up a completely different game as to what I was expecting, the version of Nix Umbra that I now understand, as opposed to the one that I had anticipated, is an experience I've become very invested in. So let's get into why. Okay, now before we get into the gameplay, I will say this. If you haven't played Nix Umbra yet, you should probably stop watching this video. This is an experience that 100% benefits from going in blind. The video will still be here after you've given the game a go, so I really recommend you do. Okay? Okay. So, as already touched on, Nix Umbra recycles a few initial beats that the previously mentioned Devil Daggers had already put into place. You start your journey by collecting the one and only weapon afforded to you, and spend your time focusing on one very similar key objective. Survive for as long as you can. Except where Devil Daggers would typically focus on an offensive point of view, with the player often powering through waves upon waves of enemies at an increasingly rapid pace, this is where Nix Umbra becomes a very different experience. Within the world presented to you, a cold black nothingness absolutely full to the brim with unknowable and often completely unseen entities that really want nothing more but to devour you, you are on the defensive at all times. Your only weapon, a shining sword of light, acts as both your shield and as a torch in the darkness. However, utilising this weapon to either deflect an enemy or to temporarily increase your field of vision will rapidly drain what also doubles as your health bar. A very limited pool of light energy. And if you run out, it's game over. The darkness will overcome you and the player is lost to the nothingness of Nix Umbra. Oh yeah, and did I mention that this is also essentially a horror game? Because yeah, while it's technically something of an arena shooter, Nix Umbra is also aiming for a straight up full-blown horror experience. And it's good at it. While the game's visuals might initially appear to be very minimal, the way light and contrast is used to depict the world around you and the entities of Nix Umbra can often be horribly unsettling. You'll hear an eerie screech or ominous hiss above you or behind you, and then suddenly be face to face with something strange or inhuman, such as a floating skull, a vicious flock of birds, a dancing circle of skeletons, or giant spiders. And speaking as someone who really doesn't like spiders very much, if you run into one of these things when you least expect it, it's fucking terrifying. So, like I've already touched on, while Devil Daggers could make you feel powerful, such as when you acquire an upgrade that will then offer an exhilarating boost of firepower and this infectious sense of triumph, by stark contrast, you never feel powerful within Nix Umbra. You crawl around beneath a merciless horde, keeping your head down in the hopes that you might go unnoticed for just a few more seconds. Because a few more seconds can make all the difference in the world between succumbing to the darkness or maybe surviving for a few more minutes. It means more time to find and eat a mushroom, something that not only temporarily shrinks you down to a smaller yet faster form, but also temporarily increases the recovery speed of your light meter. It means more time to gather crystals that, once you have enough, will allow you the chance of unlocking one of the few randomly generated upgrades. I won't go into all of these for the sake of keeping some of the game's mechanics hidden, but your best options are, that is, if either are even available to you by the time you finally gather enough crystals, will typically be either the increased speed upgrade, because as you might have noticed your movement is kinda sluggish, or the unlockable jump ability. As I'm sure you can imagine, being able to move around at a more accelerated pace is hugely beneficial to you, increasing your chances of dodging past enemies, and also allowing you to collect further crystals at a more frequent pace. Whereas on the other hand, while jumping is pretty much useless throughout 90% of the game, you're not going to be doing any platforming anytime soon, it is useful when combined with a mushroom, as it then allows you to jump up and collect the crystals while still in a shrunken form. Without the jump ability, you cannot collect them when smaller, so you need to prioritize which is more important to you. Do you skip the mushroom for the sake of collecting nearby crystals, or are you in dire need of recovery and perhaps need to risk losing those crystals? And I know what some of you are probably thinking, why can't you just jump or dash right away? That's like pretty typical first-person movement right there. Well, fuck you, that's why.
How rude!
Okay, let me answer that more seriously. Yeah, it's a little annoying at first when you realise that you can't dash or jump. Initially, it doesn't really make much sense to skip over such simple game mechanics. If anything, it feels cheap. But the thing is, in a lot of ways, Nix Umbra doesn't make sense. It's bizarre and uncomfortable, oppressive and unnerving, more akin to a spiral of madness. You're dropped into the world with a single indicative sentence hinting towards your only means of survival, and that's it. There's no hand-holding, no tutorial, no changing the difficulty. You're just there, surrounded by the horrors of the forest in a far less cutesier fashion than Don't Starve. It's a game that wants you to feel tiny, weak, and alone because, well, you are. And if you want to be faster, more agile, more capable of surviving for more extensive periods of time, you need to earn it by adapting to the rules of Nix Umbra and learning how to survive. Because this isn't your playground. Those entities floating above you are the predators. You're in their playground. And I'll be completely honest, at first I actually kinda hated this game. In fact, part of me still does, because Nix Umbra is cruel. There's literally no other way of putting it. Nix Umbra is a cruel game. That fuck you I dropped earlier, I kind of meant it. I wasn't just being a dick. To reel off some examples as to explain this further, those crystals you just meticulously acquired, yeah, those are very easy to lose if you're not careful. Flocks of birds can literally steal them from you, or scatter around the area, eating up the crystals and mushrooms you might be heading towards. Or how about this? A giant hand can literally appear from thin air above you, and if you don't deflect it fast enough, yoink, they're all gone now. Elsewhere, you might just end up walking into a tree and setting it on fire with your sword, which is fine for a temporary source of light, but oh no, doing that also uses up all of your crystals and a chunk of light energy. Yay. Oh, and you'll also notice when being attacked by certain enemies that the ring of crystal energy might slowly decrease, so you're gonna have to collect even more crystals than before, and believe me, they're really not easy to find. Now, yes, you can use the blade of your sword to identify crystals in the distance, and it's actually one of the few permanent mechanics available to you. I cannot even begin to tell you how relieved I was when I realized that this was a thing. However, if a crystal is being obscured by a monster or a tree or a rock, you're not going to see it. Which means that at times you will end up just running around in circles, panicking because your light meter is decreasing and the enemies are getting more and more aggressive and the spiders want to chew your eyes out of your skull and you're dead. Permadeath, baby, it's all over. And yet, in spite of how absolutely goddamn painstaking Nix Umbra can be, I slowly came to realize that I actually really loved it. Yeah, some of the deaths can feel pretty cheap, I'm not going to deny that, they do, as does the lack of a limited dash ability as I mentioned before. While I like the emphasis on collecting these abilities via crystals and upgrades, I don't think including a very limited dash would have been too much of a bad idea. It could have even been worked into the light meter as a form of minor penalty if you really wanted to make it more difficult. But the more time I spent in the game and the more I got used to it, the more I came to realize that these issues didn't really bother me all that much. Instead, what started as a simple, very short itinerary of, okay, what can I unlock that will help me, slowly became a more primal attitude of, okay, what have I learned about this place that will allow me to survive within it? And sure, I didn't maintain that level of zen all the time, don't get me wrong, I'd get angry with the game and I'd go do something else for an hour or two, but then I'd come back because I wanted more. The feeling of finally breaking through your previous record after so much pushback is intoxicating, as is the world of Nix Umbra, because regardless of how little I understand it, and again believe me, I barely understand it now, it feels like I'm spending an afternoon traipsing through a satanic nightmare, it's undeniably very addictive. You'll come across a weird, bizarre thing and just kind of sit back and go, huh, that's strange. There is a literal out-of-body experience in this game, and it's there for apparently no reason except to bask in orb memes. If there is a reason for this, well, I haven't figured it out yet. And I love that. I love not knowing, but feeling that I might just get there if I spend enough time in this world. And if I don't, I'm okay with it. Okay, that's really all I have to say. While I think I'm happy with everything that's been covered here, I don't want to go into the game's mechanics with any more detail than I already have because, like I said, this really is the kind of game that you want to play as blind as possible. If you stuck around until the end, then thank you, and I'm hoping I've left enough unspoken that you might consider giving Nix Umbra a go, while also having shined some light on the positives of the game. Once again, I would like to thank the developer for the opportunity of covering Nix Umbra. I was looking forward to the game prior to release, even in spite of maybe not quite recognizing it for what it was at the time, and I can certainly say I'm glad for having played it. Also, on a channel-wide note, there are now over 1,000 of you. Thank you to everyone that recently subscribed. Next up is... Actually, I have no idea. I'm that professional. I'll put something on Twitter, okay? Until next time, and Merry Christmas, you beautiful Caspers.
全国大会で優勝するほどの腕なのさ。ねクリスマスなど何の用もないわ。瓦礫の中にでも埋まっていろ。 俺は生まれてこれまでクリスマスのために生きたことなど一瞬たりともない。ジングルベールジングルベール全速前進だ。全だパーフェクトだ。ジングルベールジングルベ